We'll be getting started in just a moment. We'll give people a little more time to filter in. But thanks for joining us, everyone. And sorry to the people who have been here since 7:55 who have heard me say that like 4 times now. All right, let's jump into it. Welcome to IB Experience's 2023 Back to School webinar for sophomores. My name is Jim Wismer. I'm the director of IB Experience, and I'm joined by our co-founder, Karan Shah.
Hey there, everyone.
And so my main role at IB Experience is that I oversee our test prep and academic tutoring. So I often work with our families closely on plans for when to take the test, when to start preparing, and then also ironing out plans for solving any kind of academic issues with tutoring. Karan's main role at IB Experience is multifaceted as a co-founder. He handles a lot of behind the scenes things for us, but he also works with our families on our personal advising service, where he meets with students and parents to plan for things like course selection and extracurricular activities to set students up for success throughout high school, but also with an eye towards college admissions. The Sophomore Back to School webinar is one of my favorites every year. And it's because sophomore year is this like nice little middle ground. Freshman year is very challenging because everything's new, right? We're acclimating to high school, totally new social situation, new level of intensity in academics. All extracurriculars are brand new. Sophomore year, students are kind of settled in. They're feeling a little more comfortable about everything. But the intensity level of junior year and really focusing in tightly on the college search and SAT and ACT isn't there yet. So it's this great opportunity for students to really get the most of being a high school student for the sake of being a high school student. Now, with that said, if you're at IB Experience's Back to School webinar, then that means that chances are you're thinking about things with an eye towards college admissions, which will be coming. And so we always like to start these webinars by talking about what is actually in a student's control in this process. So there are many things in college admissions that are outside of a student's control. Your demographic information, your parents' education level, what colleges other students from your high school are applying to. All of those things are going to have an impact on your college decisions one way or another. But the 5 factors I have listed on this slide are the 5 things that students can actually make a positive difference in. So students, when you're looking to devote your time and energy to improving your chances in college admissions in any way, they should be focused on your grades and the rigor of your courses, standardized tests like the SAT, ACT, AP, and IB exams, letters of recommendation from teachers, which while you don't write them, you do control those relationships you make with the teachers, extracurricular activities, of course, and the written components of your essays and applications. So that's the way you sort of kind of pull all these factors together and tell a story about yourself. And so we're going to be going through each of these factors to some degree or another. We're not going to talk much about essays and applications because that's still very far off, and just talk about, what's important going into 10th grade and what's ahead in the years to come.
So grades and rigor of the 5 factors Jim just brought up is by far the most important. Now, grades are obviously pretty self-explanatory, but just to quickly define rigor for those that might not know, rigor is the difficulty of the courses that you've taken throughout your high school career. So whether that be an honors or an accelerated course, or maybe an AP or an IB course, what does your transcript look like in terms of the difficulty of courses offered at your school, and what classes did you choose to take? These 2 combined are the most important factor when you're applying to college. So in your freshman year, maybe you didn't have the best start. Maybe you had some grades that are lower than what you typically get due to that adjustment period. That's okay. But during your sophomore year, we really need to start to clean that up. And we'll get to what college admissions grades look like in a little bit. But you want to make sure that we're on an upward trajectory. We want to make sure that, hey, maybe we got some B's last year. Maybe we even got some C's last year. We really need to start getting those grades up because colleges think of your grades and rigor as the front page of your college application. It's the first thing the admissions officer are going to see beyond your name, right? And so for them, this is what determines whether they get to the rest of your application, whether they're reading your letters of recommendations or your essays or looking at your extracurricular activities. First and foremost, admissions officers want to make sure that you're going to be able to handle the academics, the courses when you get to a particular college. So if they're not up to par with what the college is typically looking for, the grades and rigor can get you not considered by an admissions committee or an admissions officer. With that said, sophomore grades are important. Junior year grades are the most important. We'll get to why in a second. But your sophomore year grades are going to set you up for your junior year, right? Doing well in your courses, making sure you get the best grades possible may set you up for the opportunity to maybe jump up from a regular to an honors class or jump up from an honors to an AP class. Different high schools will have different standards for what they do with course selection, but a lot of times course selection can be dependent on how well you do in a particular year course, especially if a high school has a limited amount of spots available for certain AP courses. So we want to make sure that we set ourselves up and continue to set ourselves up with a good foundation for when we get to the junior year grades, and that are going to matter the most. The start of senior year grades do matter as well. This varies a little bit by student. Some college applications are due early and are on a rolling basis, where maybe the first couple months of senior year grades might count. If you're applying regular decision at the end of December, start of January, it might be the first half of the year. And then for some students, honestly, your grades might matter all the way through April, where, hey, I might have gotten waitlisted at my first choice school, and so now I'm going to follow up with them. So we want to make sure that our grades are up to par, not only throughout our entire high school career, but kind of on the tail end as well. So the chart here is actually one produced by ACT. So if you notice, over the past slightly over a decade, ACT scores have kind of consistently gone down over the years. The mean score has gone down about 1.5 points for the SAT. That's about 30, 40 points. And high school GPAs have actually gone up. What does this mean? I know a lot of you have heard about grade inflation. Part of this is due to maybe students taking their classes more seriously, working harder in their courses, realizing that college admissions is more competitive than it's ever been. But then also at the same time, there is a level of grade inflation in high schools. High schools, whether they be public, whether they be private, they want to make sure their students have the best outcomes when they come out of high school, right? And so a lot of times teachers may be a little bit more lenient with grades. More students might get A's than typical, just because the high schools want to make sure that the students have the best opportunity when they're applying to the colleges they're applying to. This is really shown by our next slide, where we talk about the University of Pittsburgh. So this is the average GPA, average weighted GPAs of students who attended the University of Pittsburgh. Now, if you notice, 70% of the students there had a GPA over 4. Now, a 4.0 typically means straight A's. How does a GPA end up over a 4.0? Different high schools weight GPAs differently by giving students a little bit more credit for taking an honors or an AP class. So A in an honors class might be worth a 4.3, or an AP class might be worth a 4.5. But that's how you end up with a GPA over 4. But with that being said, when you factor in both the grades the students are getting, as well as the rigor of the courses those students are taking, their GPAs are ending up above straight A's, right? So this is something to consider when you're looking at most of the colleges that a lot of you are probably thinking about. Most students are applying with very, very, very strong transcripts, and we want to make sure that our sophomore year doesn't hold us back in terms of our overall GPA.
Right. And one other thing I want to make clear, and I say this because I see on our attendee list, we have many families from, for example, Lower Merion High School. Lower Merion High School is on a 5.0 GPA scale. Colleges correct that back to a 4.0 scale for something like this. So this isn't an accident of, oh, well, the high school is on a 5.0 scale. These are all corrected to a 4.0 scale as weighted GPAs.
And if your high school does it out of 100, same thing applies. Colleges will have their own determination of not only how they weight scores or weight GPAs, but also how they factor in GPAs that may be out of 100 or 110 or something like that.
Right.
So with that said, and I mentioned maybe ninth grade went really well and we got straight A's, but maybe ninth grade didn't go as well and we have some C's, we have some B's. This is really the time where we start moving on that upward trajectory. Some colleges will understand that there is an adjustment period for when you start high school. Maybe your grades weren't as strong as they were. Maybe the transition was tough. Maybe there wasn't as much hand holding as there was in elementary school or middle school. But now that we're in 10th grade, hopefully we're a little bit more settled in the school. We know how things work, and colleges want to see that improvement throughout your high school career. So whether that be getting better grades or a combination of that and taking more higher level courses, challenging ourselves a little bit more, it's really important to be on that upward trajectory. So having 10th grade, that foundation that you can work off for 11th grade as well, as I mentioned earlier. Now, with that said, as we get further in our high school career, there are things that we're going to think about in terms of what majors we want to pursue and that sort of thing. So if you are a parent of a student who's maybe considering something math related or STEM related, business, engineering particularly, those schools and those programs will typically want to have seen the student take calculus by the start of their senior year. Now, this means that the student's a year above grade level. And so that might involve taking a class over the summer to maybe catch the student up so that they're able to take a calculus course in their senior year. So that's something to consider as we talk about plans for this upcoming summer if your student's already not on that trajectory. If you're not sure what the trajectory is at your particular high school, it might be a good time to talk to your guidance counselor at the start of the year so you can not only think about your plans for this current year, but also what your plans will be this upcoming summer.
Yeah. And if you end up having to take a math class over the summer, Kron, which one would you recommend taking?
So typically it would be geometry. With that being said, if we aren't a year above grade level already, your student might be taking geometry this year. That's okay, and that's completely fine. If your high school goes algebra 1, algebra 2 geometry, now it might be a great time to take geometry after this year. With that said, if your student is taking geometry in 10th grade and the options are to take pre-calc or pre-calc over the summer, that's a conversation to have not only with your counselor, but also we can have that conversation with you as well and figure out what might be best for your student to take over the summer.
And I would say in general, you want to do that earlier. So in other words, summer after 10th would be a lot easier than summer after 11th because math levels are only going to get more challenging as you go.
And frankly, you're not going to be worried about your college applications the summer after 10th, but you are going to be the summer after 11th, right? So you just might have a little bit more time on your hands this summer than maybe subsequent summers. And we'll talk about summer plans a little bit later. With that said, course selection is going to get really important as we get to kind of this winter/spring of your sophomore year. Now, most of you have gone through this course selection in high school once already in 9th grade, but when we get to the course selection during 10th grade for 11th grade, this is when the options of APs and IBs come up for a lot of students for the first time. So it's about figuring out what courses are the best for you. Are you going to challenge yourself and take a couple of APs? Are you going to challenge yourself and maybe take an AP in a subject area that may not be your strong suit, right? So this is the time to talk to your counselors about it. There's no definitive right answer of I should take like this many APs or things like that, except for one group of students we'll talk about last, but there's no right answer of like exactly how many APs you need to be taking. But the idea is to challenge yourself, but also have a course load that you can manage. If taking that third AP course or that first AP course or that fifth AP course is going to affect the rest of your grades and bring the rest of your grades down, it might not be worth it. At the same time, if it's in a subject area that you're thinking about pursuing during college, and this is your opportunity to show off that I'm not only passionate about the subject area, but I can excel in it, that's also a different conversation as well. And so a common question that we get asked, and we actually got asked in some of our earlier webinars, is should I take an honors class and get an A, and an AP class or get a B? And frankly, the answer is it depends, right? The admissions officer is going to tell you to take the hardest class and get an A, right? But that's not always going to happen. So you can talk to your peers in your extracurricular activities, talk about what the teacher's like, what the course load is like, how much work is there, right? There are a bunch of factors that come in that are truly, really subjective, and it's worth having a conversation, actually sitting down and having a conversation about. if you do start this year or even your junior year in a particular course and you've jumped up a level and you realize, you know what, this might be too much for me, it's better to be honest with yourself sooner rather than later. You don't want to end up in a situation where you end up getting C's or D's in a course because it's a level too high, particularly in courses that are cumulative, like math, foreign languages, where if you get behind now, you're kind of setting yourself to be behind when you're in 11th grade and 12th grade as well, right? Also, this will affect, the sooner you switch, the sooner you can kind of correct your GPA, right? Like it's really going to be hard to recover from a first semester C or D if you drop down halfway throughout the year. So have that conversation with your teachers, your guidance counselors, if you feel like that's something you need to consider sooner rather than later. Now, the exceptions of students that I was saying about course selection, whether I should take the first AP or the fifth AP, is if you are a student or a parent of a student truly striving for those very top, highly selective schools, the schools that are you typically rank in your top 25, your 30, what you really want to do and what you honestly have to do is take the most challenging course load available to you at your high school. The idea is not to scheme a way of like trying to take a lower level course here and maybe they won't notice. One thing that goes with your high school transcript that everyone gets is your school profile, which talks about the AP classes that you have at your school or IBs or lack thereof. There are some high schools in kind of Lower Merion area that don't even have APs, and that you won't be penalized for that. At the same time, you should still be taking the highest level courses provided according to what your high school offers, if you're going to be looking at those highly selective universities. And at the same time, going back to our kind of grade inflation conversation, you need to be taking those highest level courses if you're considering those schools, and also be getting straight A's in those courses as well.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're not saying that that's what every student should do at all. In fact, most students shouldn't even think about just taking all the most challenging courses possible. But if this is what your students' goals are and they have that drive and determination and ability to do it, then that's the way they need to be thinking to make it a realistic option in a couple of years. All right, so all of that by way of understanding sort of the big picture of grades. What should we actually be doing this fall heading into 10th grade, to make sure that this happens? Number one is to plan around last year's performance. If you struggled in Algebra 1 and you're taking Algebra 2 this year, you need to be prepared to work a little harder in Algebra 2. Chances are you're going to have to shore up some of that Algebra 1 content that you didn't quite understand. Or if you did understand it, but it was just harder to keep up, it's going to be similarly difficult to keep up in Algebra 2. That's especially true in cumulative courses like math and foreign language, less so in, if you took biology and now you're taking chemistry or something like that, but still students tend to struggle in the same subject areas consistently. So you want to just kind of go in with a certain expectation of how much extra work different classes are going to require. You want to think about any finals or end of year testing that you're going to have, like AP or IB exams. And I say this, you're not studying for your AP exam in September. I don't mean to imply that at all. But the truth is that the better you learn the material throughout the year, the less work you're going to leave yourself to do to prepare for these cumulative exams in May and in June. So ideally, if a student is struggling, you want to intervene early. What does that intervention look like? So there are kind of 3 layers of intervention that you can take, at least the way that we see it. Number one, step one should always be reach out to the teacher for extra help. This has a side benefit when it comes to letters of recommendation. Karan will talk to us about that in a little bit. It helps you to build that relationship with the teacher. But also, teachers make themselves available before school, after school, lunch, during their prep periods. If it's possible for you to spend a little extra time with the teacher to get that material one-on-one, that's a great way to do it. Also, consider forming a study group. When I was in school, I've been peer tutoring since 8th grade. I came by my profession, honestly. And for me, one of my best ways of studying in high school was to help a friend that was struggling with the material to understand it better. Teaching is the best way to learn. Some truisms are cliches for a reason, right? That's one of them. Teaching something to your friend that's struggling is going to make you better at it. If you're the friend that's struggling, a friend helping you can also help them. So you don't have to feel bad about imposing on someone. Studying in groups can help the students on the lower end of that and the students on the higher end of that as well. So forming a study group with your peers is definitely a smart way to go, especially if you have multiple people who are, struggling to stay afloat in a difficult class, because you guys are kind of sharing that camaraderie. It can be, easy to sort of, in a way, when you need extra help, you have to be vulnerable, right? And no one likes to be vulnerable. But it's a little bit easier with your friends than it is with an adult sometimes. So assuming that these options that are available to you at school aren't going to work out, that's when you want to start thinking about tutoring as a way to help you along. So when we work with students on academic tutoring, we take a sort of teach you how to fish approach. We don't just want to hand you the fish. We want to make sure that you can reel one in whenever you need one, right? So the idea is that we're not just helping you learn this specific piece of content. We want to help you build the study skills and the habits that are going to allow you to learn more things and study them effectively in the future. We also focus, even in school subject tutoring, on test taking strategies. Test taking strategies are not just an SAT and ACT thing. Knowing the way that your teacher is going to evaluate your knowledge is really important. The way that you study for a history test where it's multiple choice and you're having to learn facts and regurgitate them is very different from the way that you prepare for a history test where most of your grade is an essay and you have to be analytical and compare and contrast things. So we're going to help you learn that material in the way that is going to be most effective for the way that you need to prove your knowledge of that material. When it comes to exams, we're always thinking how much of what a student needs is mastering the format of the test. Do you know how to write an essay response in an effective way to get the most points from your teacher? And the content, do you know the underlying knowledge well enough to actually write an essay? And so it's never one or the other in our mind. It's always kind of how much of each. Either way, I mentioned on the previous slide as well, intervening early is always better than intervening late. We are going to, like clockwork, get a ton of math tutoring requests in early October when the first test grades come back. Happens every year. And so, finding out that you need a math tutor because you bombed a test is a lot less pleasant than realizing, oh, I'm struggling here. I better get a math tutor a couple weeks before the test. So again, tutoring is not always the answer. There are other ways to solve these academic struggles, but if tutoring is necessary, then you do want to start it sooner rather than later.
So with that said, advocating for yourself, working with teachers, working to create a study group, we transition to letters of recommendation. So why are letters of recommendations important? When a a college admission officer sees A- in your geometry honors class in 9th or 10th grade, they know exactly what that means. But that doesn't tell us anything about you, what you did to achieve that grade. How did you end up in that situation? Were you participating in class? Were you helping tutor other students? Did you work really hard to get from a B- to an A-, right? So this is an opportunity for high school, college admissions officers to get to know you, about your performance in the classroom, get to know your personality. Some of your teachers may have had you for multiple years, so they might be able to see how you've grown from a 9th grader to a 10th or 11th grader, depending on what years you've had that students. So it's about to getting a third-party insight beyond what your resume and your application tells you from your teachers, and as well as your guidance counselors as well. So with that said, most students are going to be needing 1 to 2 teachers that are going to write their recommendations. Now, I know we're talking to 10th grade parents, and it says here, ideally, your recommenders are going to be your junior year core subject teachers. So core subjects, math, science, history, English, foreign language. With that said, though, it's important to learn how to build relationships with your teachers early, and so that when you get to your junior year, you've developed those skills. Furthermore, some of the teachers that you may have in some of the cumulative courses like math, like foreign languages, you may have them for multiple years. Your Spanish 2 honors teacher may be your Spanish 3 honors teacher next year, right? And so that teacher might have additional insights. So it's important to get out of your shell early and start talking to your teachers, making sure you're participating in class, but also staying after school if you need help or offering help when you can. With that said, it's not about the class you got the highest grade in. It's about people who have gotten to know you and love you the most and know the most about your personality so that they can talk about you in a glowing manner, right? So we really want to showcase your personality here. With that said, a lot of common questions we get about letters of recommendation are, well, I've had the same club coach for my soccer team for the last 4 years, and they've gotten to know me really well. Unless there are extraordinary circumstances where this person is going to be able to provide some insight that absolutely no one else would be able to, and this is going to completely change kind of the dynamic of your application, for the most part, college admissions officers don't want more information than what they asked for, right? They want to read what they asked for, and anything additional might either fall on deaf ears or frankly inconvenience them by inundating them with information. So there definitely are unique circumstances where an optional recommender might be valuable, but that, as I said, the situations are quite unique and quite rare that actually happens. Now, one person that is going to write your letter of recommendation beyond your teachers is your counselor. And so in 9th grade, maybe you developed a relationship with your high school counselor or the college counselor at your school. Maybe you didn't. That's completely okay. This is the year, and some of the stuff that we'll talk about later will relate to this, is the time to start talking to them and building that relationship so that when they might have to write 50 or 100 or 200 different letters of recommendation for all the students that they have, they're able to provide personal insight. The college admissions officers are going to be able to see that in the sea of very similar recommendations, that there is some personal thought here. The student was interested in engineering or business or theater for years and years and years, and they were showing that to the people in their lives. So with that said, you're going to not be asking for letters of recommendation this year, and that's completely okay. Again, this year is about setting the groundwork, either whether it be the skill of developing those relationships or whether it be teachers you might have for multiple years. That you're going to ask before the end of your junior year. Some teachers get a lot of requests for letters of recommendation. You all probably know there are some really popular teachers at your school who builds really good relationship with students. They may only write a certain amount each year. So you want to make sure that the teachers that you want writing recommendations for you are able to, and they don't run out of spots of students that they're able to write recommendations for. So ask before the end of junior year. This also gives the recommenders time to work on them over the summer. Just like you're out of school in the summer, so are they. They have a little bit more time on their hands to do that as well. If you haven't heard from them, or maybe you asked at the end of your junior year and they just haven't gotten around to it, that's completely okay. It's okay to check in with them, especially if you're applying to some schools that might have earlier application deadlines, to just politely remind them and also thank them as well. Now, as I mentioned, you want to ask in person at the end of your junior year. You also want to follow up with an email thanking them if they do agree to say yes. The one thing that you do in that email, you can also provide deadlines of some of the colleges you're applying to. As I mentioned, particularly if you're applying early or rolling decision schools where you might be submitting as early as August for your decisions. And so you want to make sure that they're on top of it, so the admissions committee has everything that they need to evaluate your application. Another thing that, even if your school doesn't ask for one, is something you might want to create, is a brag sheet where you talk about everything that you've done outside of the classroom that a teacher may not know about, right? So whether it be accomplishments or internships or activities or awards or things like that, that the teacher may not know about, particularly if it's in a field that you're interested in and maybe your math teacher didn't know you went to engineering camp in a particular year, or you were involved in a robotics program that's outside of school, right? This is an opportunity to give that information to the teacher as well, if it would factor into their recommendations. Now, with that said, we can also say that, like, parents, add to that brag sheet, take a look at it, right? One thing high school kids aren't always the best at is, one, bragging about themselves. Two, a lot of times they just forget, right? You remember where you drove them in 9th grade every single day and 10th grade every single day and had to drop them off and wake up at 6 a.m. So students, take advice from your parents, check in with your parents to make sure you're not forgetting anything when you're creating that brag sheet as well.
Yeah, students, there are a lot of parts of your college application that should be 100% you. The brag sheet is not. The brag sheet is about bragging, and your parents are much better at bragging about you than you are. All right, so that brings us into my personal favorite topic and everyone else's arguably least favorite topic, which is standardized testing. So I like to start the discussion of standardized testing by trying to understand, what is the actual point of standardized testing? In this world where so many colleges are test optional, which we'll talk about in a bit, why do colleges still use these scores? Or why do they use them in the first place? And the number one answer to that is to predict a student's ability to succeed at a particular college. So there are a few numbers that colleges care a lot about trying to predict. Among them are freshman year GPA. Is a student actually going to do well when they show up on campus? And graduation rate. How likely is this student to actually graduate from our institution in whatever number of years we set as the target for that? And so the number one predictor of graduation rates and freshman year GPA is a high school GPA. The number two predictor is an SAT or ACT score. So both of those factors individually are worse predictors than they are when they're combined. So the best way to predict a student's potential to succeed on a college campus numerically is to factor in both a GPA and an SAT or ACT score. That's not to say that standardized test scores are the end all be all, or that a test score tells the whole story of a student. No one thinks that. In fact, you'll see my third bullet point, test scores are part of a holistic review process, right? So they are one piece of the puzzle. They're an important piece of the puzzle because they help colleges predict things that they really need to know, but they are only one piece of the puzzle. And that's important to keep in mind as well. And the other thing that a test score allows is to compare a student with their local context. Karan made reference to the school profile earlier that goes out to a college with your transcript. One of the pieces of information on that school profile is, the potential AP courses that your school offers. Another thing that's on that school profile is your high school's average SAT and or ACT score. And so colleges can see how students at your high school with your similar background and similar education do on the test and compare you with that. So what is test optional then? Test optional is not something that's new. It's been around for a very long time, but it used to be confined to small liberal arts schools and quite few of them. Now it is most colleges. During COVID, every school had to go test optional because students just weren't able to test because of the public health dangers. But now most colleges have retained those test optional policies. But there are some that have returned to requiring test scores. So I'm going to name a couple of the most popular examples of colleges that have returned to requiring test scores among our students. That would be MIT, Georgetown, the Florida State System, the Georgia State System, and the University of Tennessee. So those are some of the popular colleges with our students that have returned to requiring tests. There are more than that, but those are the big names as far as our students go. There are a few colleges out there that are test blind or score free, and that means even if you send a score, they're not going to look at it. And so the main kind of big schools there would be the University of California system, so that's UCLA, Berkeley, et cetera, and the California State system. And
quick thing with these test blind schools is that they will look at AP scores if you submit them. And so if you've taken AP courses or IB courses, they will look at those scores and consider them, but they just won't look at SAT and ACT scores. So they're not fully test blind.
Right. Exactly. So test blind is sort of misleading. It's really SAT or ACT blind. Now, the best way to apply to college is still with a strong score. So in other words, test optional does not mean that a strong score can't help you. What it means is that a weaker score doesn't hurt you in the same way that it did before, because if you have a weaker score than you would want to share with a college, you don't have to share it. But the strong scores still help. So what we have here is data from 2022 on acceptance rates for colleges for students who do submit test scores and students who don't. So I want to be clear that not every college releases this data. So this looks like a pretty random assortment of colleges, and it is because very few colleges actually make this data public. But what we can see here is that at all of these schools, students who submitted test scores were admitted at a higher rate. Now, there is a bit of a lurking variable here, which is mainly that the students with the best GPAs tend to have the best test scores. And that means that in general, the stronger applicants are submitting test scores at a higher rate. However, what it does show us is that the best way to apply to an individual college is still to submit a score that that college considers strong. So that doesn't mean you should always submit your test score just because the students who submit them get in at a higher rate. Because if you're submitting a test score that that college would consider poor, that's not going to help you, right? But it does mean that your best chance at a college is to work to a point where you have that score that that college would consider strong and you can submit it as part of your application. So with that said, I want to talk about timing for the SAT and ACT. Now, the vast majority of you are not going to do any test prep during 10th grade. There are a few exceptions for why you might, but the vast majority of students are going to test for the first time during 11th grade. And the question of when exactly to test during 11th grade comes down to, number one, when you finish Algebra 2 and geometry. So Algebra 2 and geometry are the two last big pieces of the puzzle as far as the math on the tests go. And so you want to be finished with that math or close to finished with that math by the time you take your first official test. Now, many schools are on an integrated math curriculum now. If your school's on an integrated math curriculum, then contact me. Let me know what the title of the course that you're taking in 10th grade is and what high school you're attending. And I'll be able to tell you when you'll be finished with what is the equivalent of Algebra 2 and geometry. But essentially, if you are done with Algebra 2 and geometry or the equivalent integrated math by the end of 10th grade, then your goal should be to test as early as possible in 11th grade. And if you're going to be taking that Algebra 2 or geometry equivalent course during 11th grade, then you want to test for the first time at the end of 11th grade once you have that math under your belt. Now, there are other things that come into play here too. So the math is the most important kind of like objective thing. You need to have it to do your best. If you don't have it yet, you're not going to be ready to do your best in the math. But you also have to consider your extracurricular and real life schedule. You know, if you've been going to camp every year since you were, 9 years old and you have some of your best friends at camp, you should not skip summer camp so you can do test prep and take the test as early as possible in 11th grade, right? There is more to life than test prep, believe it or not. I know, hard to believe. There's more to your life, I should say. There's not really more to mine. But when it comes to extracurriculars, if you're a fall athlete and you're also in the fall play, right? You're a soccer player who's in the fall play. You're not going to be able to do test prep in the fall because your two most demanding extracurricular activities are happening at the same time in the fall. That means you need to wait until soccer season's over to start your test prep. So you also have to factor in, what is actually going to work for me in terms of putting the time and effort required into getting the most out of my test prep. The final thing to consider here is your mental health and workload management. And I say that because in general, we tend to recommend that students try not to test at the end of 11th grade if possible. In other words, if you have completed that Algebra 2 and geometry or equivalent by the end of 10th grade, then you want to be done with your testing before the end of junior year. The end of junior year, you're going to have final exams, final papers, final projects. Many students will be taking AP exams for the first time or more APs than they've ever taken before. Your college search is going to be heating up. There are a lot of things that are coming to a head all at once at the end of junior year, and throwing the SAT and ACT on top of that is usually unwise. So in a perfect world, you're also trying to set yourself up so that your test prep is at a time when you don't have as much going on. That typically means if you have that Algebra 2 and geometry done by the end of 10th grade, that you want to be aiming to do your test prep that summer before 11th grade, because it's a lot easier to do test prep in the summer than it is during the school year. Now, what I have here is the list of SAT and ACT test dates. And I have kind of two main schedules that most of our students end up on. Again, there are a lot of different kind of unique situations you can run into. For the students who are done with Algebra 2 and Geometry by the end of 10th grade, I recommend the yellow schedule for your first test. So you're aiming for either August or October for your first SAT, or September or October for your first ACT. And the idea is you can knock a lot of your prep out over the summer and, you know, take that test for the first time early in junior year. You have these green tests available if you need to retake, and then you're done by the end of junior year rush. If you're taking Algebra 2 or Geometry during junior year, then you want to aim for more of this lavender schedule. I think that's lavender. Karan could probably correct me. He's good with that. But the idea is you want to test for the first time, you know, near the end of that course so that you're able to do it. Now, May and June are going to be the test dates where you have the most of that math knowledge. But the March and April test dates can work really well as a first test date because you're able to do more of that prep at a less busy time of year. And then you have those later test dates for a retake if you need them. So this is what I typically recommend as a first test schedule. And again, this is not stuff in 10th grade that we're worried about immediately, but you do want to be thinking this year, what is my plan and timing for these different factors next year? Now, the classic question I get whenever it's time to talk about test dates is what SAT and ACT test dates have the easiest curves? The answer is no test date consistently has an easier curve than another test date. Now, this usually comes from people thinking about, well, the SAT and ACT are curved, and seniors also take the fall test dates, right? Seniors take the fall test dates, so juniors shouldn't take the fall test dates because the seniors are going to break the curve. The SAT and ACT, they're not curved like a college calculus class where every student who sits down and takes the test that day, certain percentage get A, certain percentage get B, certain percentage get C, and so on and so forth. The curves for the SAT and ACT are predicted. They're based on a hypothetical student population of mixed 11th and 12th graders. And the composition of students that actually sit down and take the test on any given day doesn't influence the curve. So there can be an easier curve or a harder curve. And even more importantly than that, there can be individual variation for specific students. So if there's a math topic your student struggles more with, it might show up a little more on one test than another. One of those is going to be easier for your student, one's going to be harder. But there's no way to predict that in advance. Anyone who tells you they can either misunderstands the way that the test works or they're lying to you. We recommend students plan to test twice up front because you're going to be more likely to get one of those easier or harder curves. Most of our students will test 2 or 3 times just because it gives you the most chance to find that curve that is going to be what works really well for you. And then there's also something called super scoring that comes into play, where super scoring means you can take the test multiple times, but then have your highest individual section scores counted towards your overall score. So you can, you know, if you're happy with your math score from the first time you take the test, you can retest and just focus on the verbal sections to try to raise those. For that reason, you know, most students are going to test multiple times, and you also get the added benefit of more likely to hit a curve that works really well for you. Okay, students, you're going to have 2 options for the test. There's the digital SAT. The paper SAT will be gone by the time that you're taking the test. So parents, if you had older students who took the paper SAT, the last one is this December. 10th graders, none of you are going to be taking the test by then. So your test will be in this new digital format. The scoring works the same. It's still broken into math and reading. But the digital SAT is adaptive. And what that means is you have this first reading and writing section, and your performance in that dictates the difficulty level of your second reading and writing section. So in other words, to get access to the high end of the score range, you need to do really well in the first section so that you get the harder version of the second section and then do really well in that. And math works the same way. You have a first section and your performance in that dictates the difficulty level of the second section. The new digital SAT, the adaptive nature of the test, a lot of people have asked us, well, how are you advising students strategize around that? And the answer is really that you just shouldn't think about it all that much. because at the end of the day, the best way to get the highest score possible on the SAT in this adaptive format is to focus really hard on the question that you're looking at and get it right. And then focus really hard on the next question and get it right. Focus really hard on the next question and get it right. And so focusing on the bells and whistles of how their score is calculated is not actually going to help you at all. There is no like, well, should I try to miss one or two questions? I had a parent ask me that in a presentation at one point. I was like, why do you think getting more questions wrong would ever get you a higher score? That's not how it works, I promise you. I could give a lecture on item response theory for anyone who wants it. That's the psychometric theory of how the scoring actually works. Karan's shaking his head. I assume the rest of you are shaking your head vigorously at home. The point is just get more questions right, you get a higher score. That's already how the test works, right? So it's the adaptive nature. It might mess with students' head a little bit, but it's not really it's sort of a distinction without a difference. Your other option for testing is the ACT. The ACT it has 4 sections, each scored out of 36. And then your overall score is an average of those 4 out of 36. The ACT is a little bit of a longer test, and the time limit is a little harder for students to navigate, but the level of the questions is actually a little easier on a question by question level. So that's one thing to consider between the two tests. One of the big differences, the SAT and ACT are equally accepted by every college. Parents ask us all the time, do colleges have a preference for one or the other? Do some colleges like the SAT better? Some colleges like the ACT better? They remember that was the case from their day. The answer is no. So then the question becomes, how do you decide which one to actually focus on, other than the information you've just put on this slide for me? The answer is diagnostic testing. And 10th graders, this is something you want to be thinking about this year. So the idea is you want to take the SAT and take the ACT, a practice test that is, not the official test, and compare the scores from those two. For some students, you're going to score way higher on one or the other. Just the tendencies of the test, the question types that show up more or less often, the timing, various things might just work better for you on one or the other. And if that's the case, you want to find that test that you're stronger on and just prepare for it and take that because you have a head start. For other students, your scores are going to be pretty close. And in that case, you need sort of to look at things with a more fine-toothed comb. You want to do diagnostic testing by the end of 10th grade. If you're on that earlier schedule, you're done with Algebra 2 and geometry by the end of 10th grade, so that you know what your plan is going into the summer. Or if you're on that later schedule, you want to do your diagnostic testing around the beginning of 11th grade, which is to say by the end of winter break, for sure. But possibly sooner than that, depending on what your ideal time to take the test would be. Now, we offer free remote diagnostic testing, and that means that students, you take the practice tests at home, we grade the tests and then make a test recommendation based on how you did. We'll give you feedback on your performance. And then at that point, I offer to have a call with, the parent and or the student to talk through timing. What's the best test date to target? When should we be doing prep? Answer all of your SAT versus ACT questions. And, students might have some opinions after they took the diagnostic test and they want me to weigh in on certain things. And so at that point, we work out the specific timing that works for your student individually based on their actual life. So often parents ask, as students ask, well, can I just take both and submit the score that's higher? The answer in a word is yes, you can. However, when we're talking about test prep is an investment. It's an investment of a student's time and a family's money. And the goal is to get a higher score, which should ideally result in more college options and possibly merit scholarship money. And so when we're looking at that investment, splitting it in 2 different directions is not going to be wise. You want to pick a direction and commit to get the highest return on that investment. So it can make sense for very high scoring students to try both tests, because for them, you just need to have your best day on the right day, see how it goes, and just go with what score ended up being closer to perfect. But for the vast majority of students, they should be finding, upfront, which test should I be focusing on, and then drilling in on that test and really doing their best to improve on it.
So with that said, we talked about grades and we talked about test scores, which are very objective factors, right? You're going to end up with the grades you end up in, you're going to end up with the SAT or ACT score that you do. But now what about the more subjective parts of your application? What activities should I consider? What activities should I be involved with? How much time should I be spending outside of school on these activities? Colleges want to see that you're not only just busy after school pursuing things that you want to do, but also being really involved in those things. So you want to have an honest commitment to things that are both productive. You might be learning more about a particular academic interest you have or something along those lines, or also just pursuing things that you love to do, which may be art, sports, that sort of thing. So your extracurriculars are really important when you get to really determining the difference in college admissions of what are the things that the student did outside the classroom beyond just get really good grades for our institution. So with that said, go plan for your extracurriculars to be based upon what you enjoy doing. This could be academic, as I mentioned, what you want to study. If you're interested in engineering or something like that, maybe you join a robotics club or math league or science league. If you're interested in something more humanities based, maybe you join Model UN or debate. Or if you're interested in the arts, maybe you join theater. Join the clubs and activities that you're passionate about. Now that we're in 10th grade, I'm sure many of you were in a few clubs in 9th grade. If you weren't in a lot, that's okay. But at the start of this year, you do need to make a proactive effort to start pursuing those clubs, right? Just because you go to the first meeting or two of a club doesn't mean you have to be committed to that club for the next 30 years of your high school career. Go to a club and see if you not only like the work that the club does, what the club's involved with, but do you like the community there, right? Is it a group of people that you seem to get along with really well, who maybe it's not something you're completely interested in, but you know what? I love this community. I want to be a part of it. And I can see their passion behind this thing. I find it, let me interesting. Let me see if it's going to become a passion for me, right? And so finding your places in those clubs is important because on your college applications, you want to be someone who comes across as someone who makes sense, right? Someone who's pursuing things that they're interested in, that they're passionate about. If you're going to be planning your activities based upon what just seems impressive or you think seems impressive for your college application, don't worry about that. There are a lot of there's a lot of summer programs we get asked about that are very much pay to play of, hey, my parents paid X amount of dollars and I signed up for it. Now, there might be some value in them in terms of I'm getting to pursue biology at this camp because I'm really interested in it. I can find out more about it. That's great because you're pursuing an interest. At the same time, it's not going to be adding value to your college application in the sense of, hey, like I did this this camp and I'm going to get in. So do the things that you're passionate about because you want to learn more about them, because you enjoy doing them, not because you're looking at them just for the sake of your college application. Now, 10th grade, with some of you that, as I mentioned, like you may not have been in many clubs and you need to pursue some stuff. Say you were in some clubs last year, right? And you tried a bunch of different things and you've narrowed it down to the few activities or clubs that you're really passionate about. This is the year where you can start to get more involved. Is there any 10th grade leadership positions that you can run for? If not, maybe this is something you consider at the end of the year, especially if the club has elections, thinking about becoming the treasurer or vice president or even the president for some of them, right? So see how you can get more involved, take on more responsibility in your clubs, be more involved beyond just a member who shows up to meetings. Now, with all of these, I know I mentioned primarily school-based things in terms of clubs, activities. Things you do outside of the school also completely count. So this could be like community organizations, they could be religious organizations, it could be volunteer work that you've been doing with your family for years. All of that stuff counts. So just make sure you get more involved and you're adding to your responsibility load in those activities as well. Also, you can just pursue things that you're interested in. If you want to start a podcast or a YouTube channel, go for it. If you have an Instagram page that's dedicated to baking and cooking, that's great. Like put your work into the things that you're passionate about, and then we'll figure out the ways to show how they end up on your college application, right? The idea is to find those activities that you're involved with or those things that you do that can provide tangible, objective results that we can talk about later on. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet that a lot of you will have the opportunity to do the first time this year is get a job. Hey, you weren't old enough to get a job when you were younger, and that's completely okay. If you're a little lacking on the extracurricular activity front, a job is a great way to go, right? A lot of clubs in your school, like, yeah, you might not make the basketball team or soccer team or field hockey team, but most of the clubs in your school, if you show up and you're a member in that club, no one's going to stop you. At the same time, if you don't do well at your job, you're going to get fired, right? And so this is a place where someone's showing that you have the responsibility, you have the commitment, you're able to, someone's paying you to be somewhere. So jobs are a great thing to have on your college application, particularly if it's something that you plan to hold on to for a couple of years. Yeah, you might say you're working at a supermarket, you might start out stocking shelves, but then you might get promoted to a cashier or an assistant manager who might be helping open or close or things like that. And those added responsibilities really do add value to your college application. So make sure to pursue those things that you want to do. With that said, your summers are going to matter. As Jim mentioned earlier, like going to camp is completely okay, right? And if you've gone to camp for years, that's great. But now many of you may be aging into becoming CITs, counselors in training, or you might become a counselor yourself in subsequent years, right? And so that's a great way to stay involved. If you're not someone who goes to camp, okay, that's okay. But let's figure out a plan for the summer. Am I going to pursue an academic interest? Is there something I'm really passionate about that I can spend the summer like really working on? That's not to say you shouldn't be hanging out with your friends. If you want to play video games, go out to eat with your friends, go to the movies, do everything, go to the mall, do what you want to do. At the same time, there should be a couple hours a week that like you're dedicating to an activity that's going to add value to you, both either academically or you pursuing a particular interest. Now, with that said, some of you may have done activities already in ninth grade where you ended up on college campuses for a Model UN conference, or you were at a college gymnasium for a tournament for one of the sports you participate in. When you get to those campuses, start to learn a little bit about them, right? If you don't remember the ones in ninth grade, think back a little bit. And what did you like about those campuses? What did you not like? What did you like about the students who are maybe running the conference or the tournament that attend the school? And what sort of interactions did you have with them, right? So there's always going to be that passive research that you may have started in ninth grade that will continue on through 10th grade. But now it's also the time to figure out, what do you want out of your college experience, right? So you may not know what you want to study yet, and that's completely okay. By the time you make those decisions a year from now, a year and a half from now, 2 years from now, you will find many colleges that fit the academic profiles that you're looking for, right? That have the academic resources that you're looking for. But fundamentally, we want to make sure that you're finding a home that you will enjoy and thrive at for years to come, right? Does having a D1 football team matter to you and having Saturdays on campus be devoted to that? Do you care about being in New York City and having access to restaurants, arts, museums, that sort of stuff? Or do you prefer the quiet of Ithaca and Cornell and there's not much around beyond cold and just the two college campuses, right? With the same student who thrives in New York might not be the same person that thrives in Ithaca. So think about where you want to live and where you want to make your home for 4 years, because that's going to make your college experience the best that it can be. And honestly, will produce the best grades. You'll be in the happiest situation to go out and pursue job opportunities, internships, that sort of thing. Also, as 10th graders, if you have any older siblings that have that are going on college visits or cousins or things like that, it can't hurt to tag along, right? Especially if it's an easy trip to take. See what you like about the campus, see what you don't. Maybe you're like, hey, I don't want to go to college 15 minutes from home, but my older sibling does. That's completely okay, right? Still go on that visit, because if you're going on a visit, especially with very little pressure, you can see what you like about a college and what you don't. You also see what tours are like, what schools like to showcase. So then when you do decide to visit the schools that you're truly interested in, you've gone through the process. You're looking for those qualities that you really like. You're hoping the school doesn't have those qualities you didn't like. So start doing that research now, so that when you get to 11th grade, you have a little bit of a foundation of what you're looking for in your school, which can help you narrow down your college search.
Yeah, for me, I was on the winter track team, and almost all of our meets were at Lehigh University. And that is one of the ways that I learned that I wanted to go to school in a city. For those of you that don't know, Lehigh University is very much not in a city. At the same time, I had, from that track team, from my year and the year ahead of me, I believe 5 different people just from that team went to Lehigh. Meaning they got to that campus and thought, wow, this is really what I want. I could totally see myself here. I got to that campus and thought, I need to find something that's the exact opposite of this. I'll go crazy here. And that's the point. It's just, start to figure out what will and won't work for you. You don't have to make specific decisions about specific colleges necessarily, but you can learn a lot. All right. So appreciate all of you who have hung around for the full hour. So now we're going to go through just sort of a brief overview of what you really want to be able to look back and say that you did in June of this year. And then we'll jump into Q&A. So first of all, you want to focus on getting the best grades that you can between now and the end of the year. And if you are taking any AP exams or anything like that, get the best scores that you can on those. In other words, your academic performance should really be your priority, especially if you're concerned about eventual college admissions. By the end of this year, you want to have a plan for SAT and ACT prep. If you're on that later math schedule, then that means, okay, when am I going to take a diagnostic test later on or something like that? If you are on an earlier math schedule, you should know this is the test date I'm targeting. This is when I'm going to start my test prep and all of that. And you should have already done that diagnostic testing. You want to really start to figure out which of those extracurricular interests that you want to pursue with more depth. Meaning, where junior year, are you going to try to run for office in a club? Are you going to try to kind of make more of a name for yourself, win an award or something like that? And then finally, make sure you're making informed course selection decisions for junior year in January and February when it comes time for that, to set yourself up for success from both an academic rigor standpoint and a GPA standpoint. So with that said, thanks for joining, everyone. We are going to post this to YouTube, so if you want to share it to anyone, it is going out to the full list of 10th grade students, so look out for that, most likely on Monday. So please do share it around with any other families you think would benefit from it. And now we'll open it up to your questions. So first question here is, what if your student completed geometry freshman year? And I assume we mean completed Algebra 2 and geometry freshman year. Would they still want to wait until August before junior year to take the first test and do test prep, or do test prep the summer before sophomore year? In other words, if you have that math finished earlier, does it make sense to test even earlier? And what I would say is, for most students, no. Now, one thing that helps you in standardized testing, which is another factor in when to test that I didn't really cover, is that teenagers' brains are still growing. In other words, especially the reading section of the test, a student will get better at it just by waiting from, the end of 9th grade to the end of 10th grade, for instance. So I would suggest waiting until you have a certain level of maturity to prep for and take the test the first time. Now, if you have a student who's very advanced, we've had students who score near perfect on diagnostic testing taken early in 10th grade, then go ahead and just take it early and knock it out. But that's a very exceptional situation. That's like the top 1% of the top 1%. In general, I would recommend waiting. I think from my perspective as a test prep tutor and Karan's perspective as a test prep tutor, Karan, I think we'd both say the best possible problem a student could have in test prep is that they're so advanced in math that they haven't covered the math that's on the test for like 2 years.
Yeah, you definitely run into those kids who might have are super ahead and they're taking calculus in their sophomore year and they're like, I don't remember any of my geometry formulas from years ago, right?
Yeah, how do you do the distance formula from Algebra 1? Yeah, and honestly, as a test prep tutor, we're licking our chops. Those are the students that you show up, you get questions wrong because you forgot things. It's going to be so easy for you to remember math that you were doing when you were 12. So you really do not have to worry about something like that. I'm exaggerating at 12, obviously, but the point is, if you've learned that math so long ago because you're so advanced in math, that's not really a problem. It's something that's the easiest possible thing for us to fix in test prep, if a student is so good at math that they haven't looked at the math in years. All right. Karan, our next question is one I think you should tackle, which is, do colleges still want students to be well-rounded?
No. So before it was like we want to make sure that we have sports and volunteering, and we kind of have a checklist of things that we want the student
Did
to
you
do.
play your instrument? Did you ladle out soup at a soup kitchen? Did you play your sport? Yeah.
Exactly, right? And now the idea is that was the student staying busy and does the student make sense, right? So that's not to say you can't pursue a singular interest in a variety of different ways, right? So for example, say you play tennis and you are on your high school team and maybe you're on a travel team. You can also get a job coaching at a tennis camp, right? And that's still another job, a different way to pursue a similar activity, show responsibility in a different way. You can volunteer by getting old tennis equipment together and donating it to an underserved community, or maybe a summer camp or something like that, right? So that's not to say to not pursue your interest in a variety of ways. Pursue them in ways that make sense for you. That's not to say don't volunteer at a soup kitchen, right? Like there's absolute value in doing volunteer work that you're passionate about and in helping your community. But do it because you're passionate about it, not just because you're trying to do something to add to your college application. They want students that make sense as people, and have students that make sense so that when they get to a college campus, what are they going to be able to replicate? What are they going to be able to pursue or continue to pursue? What kind of person are they going to be on campus? And like it, for lack of a better word, the idea of someone being a jack of all trades is not necessarily what a college admissions officer is looking for.
Yeah, one of the buzzwords we've been hearing recently is the pointy applicant. You know, the opposite of well-rounded, an applicant that's pointy, and that would mean taking an interest like Kron's tennis example and really developing that in a strong way, or taking something like robotics and really going very far with it. I think especially for some of the more competitive, like engineering type things and computer science, a lot of those schools are really looking for those pointy applicants. Again, we don't want to over engineer things to the point that like every activity your student does should be chosen based on how it's going to look to a college. That's kind of taking it too far in one direction. But in general, finding one or a couple things and really developing those interests is going to matter a lot more than just ticking all your boxes. Good. All right. So it looks like that's all we have for questions tonight. So thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions that are more specific to your student, then please feel free to reach out. If you call that number, I'm the one who usually answers. You can reach me or Karan at that email address. I'm going to post the sign up link for our personal advising service. And personal advising is essentially a one-on-one meeting. When I say one-on-one, it means with Karan and with your family. So we want at least one parent and the student, but multiple parents are welcome to join, where we talk through all 5 factors, but instead of giving our sort of general overview on what's 10th grade going to be like, it's more, let's talk specifics for your actual student. If you're interested in setting one of these meetings up, you can go ahead and fill the sign-up form there. If you have any specific questions, like I said, feel free to reach out, and hope you all have a great night. Thanks for joining us.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.